The Last of Us is a show that will premiere on January 15th on HBO and subsequently stream on HBO Max and is based on the video game of the same name. And this is going to be a spoiler-free review of the first season of the show. Don't worry, I'm not going to give anything away. 20 years after an outbreak has taken place that has caused people around the world to turn into infected creatures and decimate the world's order and population, Joel, played by Pedro Pascal, has to transport a girl named Ellie, played by Bella Ramsey, across the country in hopes of hopefully developing a vaccine, as her blood is immune to the virus and she could help create a cure. The Last of Us is one of the best video games that I've ever had the pleasure of playing, and when I remember playing it the first time, I couldn't get it out of my head for a long time after. The performances, the visuals, the way it was developed in terms of its writing and direction, the action sequences. This was a perfect game in every way, and I would argue on some days I consider it my favorite game of all time. And so naturally, when you find out that your favorite game of all time is potentially getting its adaptation and it's going to be brought to the screen, there's excitement, but there's also some nervousness. Because you're kind of thinking in your head, what could you do next? But also, what if you don't do something right? And so there's naturally that part of the brain that starts operating at maximum overdrive. But after watching the show, I can say a few things. Number one, my worries pretty much dissipated immediately after the first episode. Right out the gate, the scale and scope of The Last of Us is shown perfectly. This is a show that fully understands the environment that the games have pulled off so well, and it puts you into that very effectively. It adds on certain things that you saw in the games, and it manages to create a much more worldwide image, so to speak, where it sort of makes you understand the situation. And I think Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann and co. have worked together to create something that goes beyond the game while also adding some stuff to it and some changes along the way that actually make for a pretty strong adaptation. If I had to say right now that this was my favorite live-action video game adaptation of all time, I would be saying yes, that it definitely hits those marks and it ticks off those boxes, because what they've done here is very special. It's not perfect. I do have some issues and quibbles with it, but one thing that it does absolutely nail, which is I think the show's and the game's most important asset, is the chemistry between Joel and Ellie. Without these two, the show fails. The game fails. And so you want to make sure you pull this off in the best way possible. And I think in Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, you have two outstanding portrayals of these characters, especially Bella Ramsey. They're doing an amazing job as Ellie over here. And if you had any doubts about this performance, throw it out the window. I think if anything else, the way Bella captures Ashley Johnson's performance, despite the fact that they've said in interviews that they were told not to play the game, I think they captured it so well at times they were actually channeling Ashley Johnson's voice in a couple of scenes, which is insane to think about. And Ellie herself in the show, she's incredibly funny and, while emotionally distraught as well, brings so much charisma and life to the entire proceedings, and just like the games, she's an incredibly well-rounded character. They expand on her moments very nicely, and she's even got like puns and stuff like that, which are really reflective of the character even from the games. So all those jokes continue to land over here as well. I think that's one of the strongest things about this show that I honestly had faith in since day one. I saw Bella Ramsey as Lyanna Mormont in Game of Thrones, and right then I knew whatever performance they're in next, it's gonna be an awesome performance, and this is exactly what I meant by that. But make no mistake, Pedro Pascal as Joel is also fantastic. Once again, does a great job of bringing the character that Troy Baker already perfected in the games really well, but also bringing his own energy and flair to it in some really interesting ways. Something that the show does very well, and it can do now because two games exist, is it manages to somewhat merge in things that we know across both in order to create a more well-rounded character. And something that the show does very nicely that as a result of that is it has these moments with Joel that I would honestly think enhances that character. Like there's one scene in particular with him and his brother Tommy, played by Gabriel Luna, who's also really good at this, by the way. And it's a fantastic moment because it sort of grounds exactly what Joel is going through in this moment. And sometimes you're on the move so much when you're playing the games that you're often able to miss out on those few things, even though it may come up in like conversations now and then if you pause and take a beat. But this one, I think, goes a step further in one particular regard, and I thought that was really, really good. As for the characters, others from the games that you may know, Anna Torv as Tess was fantastic, and you get really great stuff with her. Merle Dandridge, who plays Marlene in the games and in the show, is once again really, really good. Nick Offerman as Bill was great, and let's talk about Bill for a minute, because in the games, Bill, the character you get, there is another aspect to him which they don't really go into, and that is his relationship with his partner, Frank. As you may know in the games, Frank, well, this is Frank.
What, you know this guy or something?
Frank.
Who the hell's Frank?
He was my partner. He's the only idiot that would wear a shirt like that.
But in the show, they decide to do a bigger story around this character, in this one played by Murray Bartlett, who you may know from The White Lotus, and he's really good in this. This particular thing that they do, I think, is a fantastic addition, and I'm actually curious to hear what people are going to think of it. As far as the storyline and the way things are developed, I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see how some fans react to it, but I think it's one of the strongest things that the show pulls off overall, and it adds so much to the thematic element of the two games and also the show. At the end of the day, it's not so much about the infected creatures going around, it's about the connections that we create and the sort of love and, you know, the idea of protecting what you can and having what you have right now and holding on to it. Because things are in a world right now where they're just falling apart instantly. And before you know it, something will be gone in a flash. So before that happens, you need to make sure you've cherished every moment, every second. And I think the show capitalizes on this feeling across its characters in spectacular ways. It is easily the best aspect of this show. Other things like Riley, played by Storm Reed, because they do the Left Behind storyline in this, I thought they captured really, really nicely. But the one thing that I feel like people will really want to hear about right now from me is the action sequences. So let's talk about that. They're not as much in this as they are in the games. They have mentioned in interviews that they've toned it down a bit here. But make no mistake, when they are in the show, when they're dialed up to 11, you're going to witness some truly spectacular stuff. There's one scene in particular that I've already seen a bunch of times because it's such a brilliantly done action sequence. And it's one that I'm sure is going to be talked about for a long time. And I can't say what it is because it would like spoil stuff and I want to wait for people to check it out. So maybe I'll do a spoiler review down the line and go more into that stuff. But going back to the changes for another minute, something that they do, which has become a news report recently, so I feel like I can say a little bit, is that they removed spores from the show. Now, in the games, spores are essentially how the infection was spreading. And if you breathe in those spores, then that's how you get it. And so you had to wear masks in areas where there was a dense amount of them, because otherwise if they got into you, you got infected. In the case of the show, they go for something which is more hive mind-like with tendrils. And I think it's a very interesting concept. Like, see it in the context of the show, it's actually used in a very effective way. And I thought it was a smart little addition. Whether or not it's better than spores, I leave that to the viewer, but make no mistake, it's not like they haven't justified this change. I think at the end of the day, any kind of conversation that goes around on the internet when it comes to a change or something like that, obviously it's going to be met with a lot of comments, but more specifically, context is key. Try to take a second before anything just to take a look, and you might be actually pleasantly surprised with some stuff that they do. It's the same thing that happened with The Last of Us 2. While I admit that not everyone was happy with the choices that they made all the time, again, with the added context of what was going on, it made more sense as to why they're doing what they're doing. And so I think that that's going to help a lot when it comes down to judging this show. Like I said, it's not perfect all the way. There are things that do get affected in terms of like pacing and in terms of the storytelling that could have been enhanced upon a little bit more. One of the things that they add in here is a character played by Melanie Lynskey, who's very good, but that entire subplot is not quite as finely paced as some of the other sequences. Like, you get a lot of stuff with her, which I thought, oh, I mean, it's keeping the momentum ever so slightly lower than it is with the other sequences. But at the end of the day, it also has a payoff, which is pretty solid, so I can't really complain about it too much. But there are things that they have adapted straight from the games that I thought they kind of rushed through, and I thought that was a little strange, because there's a sequence, a couple of them in particular, where in the games I remember being on them a while longer, but in the show they kind of go through that in like a span of 5 minutes. And I suppose the logic is, well, in a game you have to sort of map it out and figure out how to get out of there because, you know, NPCs are coming. But in the show you're just kind of be like fast going through it. But at the same time I was like, well, you could have taken a little longer and at least let it breathe out a bit. Nonetheless, it's still like it works for the most part. It just feels like very rushed at times, which didn't make any sense to me. Like, you have a lot of time in this show to pull off certain things. It's just a little thing that did kind of bother me a little bit. I do, however, want to make note of the fact that if you're somebody who wanted to watch a carbon copy of the video game and the show, then I would suggest just playing the game. Because an adaptation, changes are made, there are things that they do a little differently, and I think in this case, it's trying to tell its own story as well with the material. I think at the end of the day, what really mattered, as me personally, is that I wanted a show that captured what made the games work, what made the games special. When I get out of the games, the creature design, which is great by the way, the stuff that you get with the clickers and even the bloater at one point is immaculate. Major props to the production team on pulling off some spectacular visuals and gorgeous action sequences. But when it goes back to the games, it also comes down to that emotional core. And they pulled that off really, really well. And so I would say as a show, it's not 100% doing what the games do, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I think it justifies everything that it does do, which is slightly different. But overall, it manages to be a very solid adaptation of the game. And it is probably my favorite live-action video game adaptation to date. And I highly recommend, of course, checking it out. If you're a fan of the games, you were going to check it out anyway. And I'm excited to see the reactions coming in from fans over the course of the next few weeks as the episodes drop and the conversation around it build. But like I said, some things you're just absolutely going to love. And I know for a fact because they're just so well done. You can't not appreciate some of the craft and a lot of the craft on display, in fact. And I think that is to be commended in its own regard. I'm going to give The Last of Us Season 1 an A-. I cannot stress how much I kept thinking about the two lead performances after it was over. Like, these two are so goddamn brilliant in this show. And I mean, like, again, whatever doubts you had, throw it out the window. I'm telling you, you're gonna see some great stuff over here. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Look forward to more reviews very soon. Did you guys have a chance to play The Last of Us at any point? Let me know which is your favorite one down below. Why do you love the games? If you don't like them, you know, whatever. Let's have a conversation about that. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe. And always remember, if you are lost in the darkness,